This week, Paul and I interview Aleksei Tiurin, Senior Security Researcher for Acunetix. In the news, exploiting developer infrastructure is insanely easy. The maintainer of the event stream library speaks out on maintaining old projects. And AI mistakes a bus side ad for a famous CEO, then charges them with jaywalking. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Rapid7 powers the practice of SecOps. Using shared data, analytics, and automated workflows, SecOps unites IT, DevOps, and security teams to make security an outcome of innovation. Rapid7 combines technology, expertise, and advocacy to drive vulnerability management, application security, incident detection, and log management for more than 7,000 organizations worldwide. Power up your SecOps practice with a free trial at rapid7.com/securityweekly.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 42, our 43rd episode of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I'm excited to be joined once again by my illustrious co-host, Paul Asadorian.
Episode 42. I'm excited. I expect you to have the answer for me. Oh, wait. The episode number is the answer, but sort of it depends on how you count, I guess.
Well, I think that this episode will definitely knock your socks off, to say the least. Before we jump in, though, one quick announcement. Join us for a webcast with Chronicle entitled Intelligence-Powered Malware Hunting. This webcast will be held this week, December 5th at 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Go to securityweekly.com/chronicle, that's CHRONICLE, to register now.
Oh, and Keith, were you at B-Sides Rhode Island?
No, I was not. No, but are we doing? Isn't that coming up soon? Maybe.
Besides Boston, do you remember the guy Brandon that presented with Allison around that time?
Yes, I'm really familiar.
Yeah, if you go back to that slide, that's the Brandon.
Oh, what? No way.
Yes, way. I thought I was the only one. I'm like, nice to meet you, Brandon. I'm like a prep call. And he was like, oh, well, you've met before. I'm like, crap, I hate it when I do that. And that's the Brandon that presented with Allison. So, yeah. And he's a total ninja. I've seen the slides. Everyone should register. It's going to be awesome.
It's kind of like when we met up at, what was it now? Louisville Airport.
Yes.
Same sort of situation. So with that, I just want to welcome our guest today. Aleksei Tiurin is a security researcher and pen tester with over 8 years of experience in penetration testing and a particular focus on ERP and banking systems, including Windows networks. For the last 4 years, he's been focusing on web hacking and holds a position as senior security researcher at Acunetix. Also, Aleksei maintains a Java deserialization cheat sheet and is the co-organizer of DEF CON Russia, or DEF CON Group 7812. Aleksei, welcome to the show.
Yoo-hoo. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be with you here again.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome, honestly. So, Aleksei, you gave a talk at Zero Nights on the interesting habits or behaviors of reverse proxies. And I thought that you might enjoy talking a little bit about that. Of course, for other listeners that want to go out and check out more about Acunetix as well, they can go to acunetix.com/securityweekly. But in the meantime, Aleksei, tell us a little bit about your talk at Zero Nights on reverse proxies. Like, how and why did you decide to go after this topic, and what did you find?
Yeah. Actually, yeah, I can show you some slides, and I will. One moment. Yep. Do you see them?
Yes.
Yeah, you're good. It's up on the screen.
That's cool. So basically, like modern web applications, they usually consist of many components, and one of usual components is reverse proxy or load balancer or something like that. And reverse proxies, they are used for many purposes. For example, to route certain requests to certain backend servers, or to restrict access to several areas on the backend application, or to perform some kind of actions with response, to modify response from backend web application, or to cache responses. So, and usually all these rules of reverse proxies, they are path-based or location-based. And the idea of research, it was quite simple, to see how different implementation of reverse proxy, how do they parse requests, how do they decode URL decodes it, and how it normalize the path to how it performs path normalization, and how it sends requests to the backend server. It sends initial request or processed request. So the idea was to check a lot of configuration of most common implementation of reverse proxies or load balancers or cache proxies, and to find out some kind of inconsistency between how reverse proxy process requests and how usual web servers process them. And if we find such inconsistency, we can bypass some kind of restriction or which are located on reverse proxy, or we can get more access on the backend web application. I have here is one simple example of kind of interesting. It's kind of not well known, but known the behavior of Nginx, how it works, but it's known not for everyone probably, and I think it's interesting. For example, you see here we have almost completely the same configuration of Nginx, which proxy requests to some kind of backend server. The only difference there is this is trailing slash. You see here, there is trailing slash, and here we don't have. And only this one trailing slash completely changed how Nginx resend requests to the backend server. If we send such request with such a weird path, relative URI, then in case of configuration on the first configuration, Nginx will send this request, normalize it and decode it path to the backend server. But in case there is no trailing slash, it will resend unprocessed path to the backend. It maybe looks not so interesting, but if we look at some kind of example, like here, for example, we here have Nginx and Weblogic on the backend, and on Nginx we have restriction, which so nobody can access a console of the backend of WebLogic. But using such a simple request, an attacker can access the WebLogic's console, administrative console, because for Nginx, when it sees such request, it finds that there is a hash sign. And for Nginx, everything that is located after hash sign is just a fragment, so it doesn't care about all this content. But actually, Nginx sends to the backend all these requests in this unnormalize it, unprocess it. But for WebLogic, hash sign is a usual symbol, so it normalize request, and for WebLogic, with such request, we as attackers, we access console on the backend.
So basically, you can do directory traversal just by putting in a hashtag to say, okay, just go to the next layer up, and then Nginx is just like, okay, and we'll do it automatically for you.
Almost like that. For Nginx, this is not for Nginx. Everything which is located after a hash sign is fragment, and it doesn't process it anyhow. So for Nginx, this request looks like Nginx uses these rules. So it sees slash, and that's it. But for WebLogic, hash sign is the usual sign. So WebLogic normalizes this path, and for WebLogic it will be console.
So Nginx doesn't rewrite the URL; it just says it passed the filter and just passes it along.
Yeah. It just passes it like from the request.
Got it. So what it ends up doing then is it passes it along to WebLogic. WebLogic basically takes care of all of the rest of the fragments, and then says, okay, cool, you want the console, and then we'll pass it back or respond. Okay, now that you've bypassed the web server.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's just a simple example. And another maybe key point of the research that we can misuse some kind of rules, some kind of configuration of reverse proxy for our purpose. I mean, from the point of view of attacker. For example, here we have Nginx and Tomcat as a backend server, and Tomcat by default has X-frame option header, which completely protected against clickjacking attack. But for example, in case some part of Tomcat application must be allowed to be opened in some kind of iframe, and it is kind of safe part of a web application. Someone creates such kind of rule on Nginx to delete this X-frame option header, and it is a kind of safe configuration, but Tomcat parses and normalizes requests differently, so we can force Nginx to delete these headers, and in the same time, Tomcat will return us a different response, different page. Yeah, so in this case, we can, as attackers, we can perform a clickjacking attack. You see here, an attacker creates a page with iframe, and it points to such a URL. And for Nginx, this URL starts with iframe safe, so it deletes X-frame option header, which Tomcat sets. But for Tomcat, it is after normalization, after past normalization, this will be completely different URL, because Tomcat supports path parameters. So you see here, we can, as attackers, we can force, we can use some kind of rules of Nginx, of reverse proxy, and apply them to different parts of web application, which on the back end.
And so these are all URL encoding as well, or at least some of this is URL encoding. You would think that the reverse proxy would be able to understand that and catch it in advance, but do things like Tomcat and Nginx not have that sort of capability to, first decode the URL encoding and then determine the rule set, or is it just kind of passing along with the URL encoding first, and then it only looks for the strictest rule set right out at the front?
Actually, I would say in this way, like most common web servers and reverse proxy like Nginx, they almost correctly, parse request, they correctly will decode it, and they perform path normalization, and only after that they apply rules that are in the configuration. Something like that. But there is difference how web servers and reverse proxy are dependent on implementation, like here. The difference is only small. There is only small difference that Tomcat supports path parameters and Nginx doesn't support them. Doesn't know about that they exist at all. And because of this difference, we can perform some kind of attacks.
Now, what sort of attacks would you generally leverage once you have this sort of access? Would you be able to do some sort of remote code execution, or would you be trying to maybe access files or overwrite files potentially based on the request? What sort of general attacks would you see being used in this case?
Actually, the main idea here is that there are two types of attacks. The first one that we can bypass some kind of restrictions on the reverse proxy. So if some part of backend web application is not accessible due to restriction on reverse proxy, we can try to bypass this restriction, because this inconsistency how reverse proxy and backend web application parse the requests. The second type of attack is probably some kind of misrouting. For example, when reverse proxy wrote only to a certain endpoint of the backend web application, not to the root of the backend web application, but to some kind of directory of the web application. But again, due to some kind of inconsistency, how different implementation parse the request, parse the path, we can access additional endpoints of the backend. And the last type probably of attacks, which is covered in our research, is client-side attacks, and mostly we are focusing on attacks like web cache deception or web cache poisoning. Like in our research, we are trying to show more cases where can we perform these attacks. Yeah. How can we misuse some kind of configuration of reverse proxy or cache proxy, and to be able to exploit such attacks as cache poisoning and web cache deception.
So if you had a cache poisoning attack, just for our listeners, what sort of things could you do once you poisoned that cache for the web server? Could you probably redirect it to maybe your own site for things that it might otherwise be requesting for resources? Is that the sort of thing you would do with it?
Actually, with the idea that, for example, the idea of web cache poisoning attack is that if we can somehow, for example, manipulate the response of web application, and we can, I don't know, and for example, the simplest example, we can inject something into the response of web application, but like self XSS, for example. But we cannot exploit this because this is safe XSS. We cannot give it to anyone. But in some cases, as attackers, if there is a cache proxy and it caches responses due to some kind of rules, we can create a special request which will be cached by reverse proxy. I mean, we create a request, send it to our victim, and this request will be with our XSS payload. Web application returns to us this XSS payload, and this is still the same self-access, but we can force a reverse proxy or cache proxy to cache this response. So in this case, this self-access now will be not self-access, but a usual access. So we can give this kind of special URL to our victims, to users, and can exploit them and steal some of their information.
Gotcha. So it's a situation where you first need to mess with the proxy by caching kind of that particular page as being an XSS payload type attack. And then from there, once you do like a phishing campaign, rather than having the browser protect them potentially from a reflected cross-site scripting, in this case, they are going to get just regular cross-site scripting because the web proxy is pointing them to a page that is already has the exploit embedded in it. Is that maybe a good summary?
Yeah, actually, yeah. But actually, all these web cache poisoning attacks, they're kind of complex. I mean, depending on implementation of backend web application, you can achieve some kind of XSS related, similar to XSS attacks, just by misusing some kind of technology. So it's not always, real XSS, but just some misconfiguration sometimes or something like that. So it has good potential.
Gotcha. And in your research, what are some of the things that you find that you've been enjoying playing with in terms of different web servers or different types of frameworks or languages? Is there anything in particular that that you find enjoyable in kind of your exploration of the web and vulnerabilities such as this?
Yeah, actually, so far we have covered several in configuration of Nginx, Apache, and HA proxy. It is a load balancer. Also, Varnish cache proxy, and also I have tested several other implementation, but I'm still in the process of conversation with vendors to be able to share this information. But maybe the funny thing, interesting thing for me, that for example, such things as Varnish cache proxy or HA, this load balancer, sometimes they have their own area of usage, how to use them, but sometimes people, for example, try to restrict access to some kind of to restrict access with them. But both Varnish cache proxy and HA proxy, both of them don't process anyhow the requests, the incoming requests. So they don't know how to normalize the path. They don't know how to even how to URL in the code the request. So it's so easy to bypass such restrictions. I mean, from the point of view of attacker.
Yeah, Aleksei, it sounds like it's even easier to bypass than a WAF, that's really a really scary statement.
So it was interesting for me to to see how people I mean how people misuse them somehow. I mean that load balancers they must balance incoming requests between backend servers, and you should not restrict access to certain endpoints on the backend just by configuring your load balancer.
I agree. I mean, having done some Nginx configuration, you can definitely use it to as like an access restriction. And as you pointed out, you definitely don't want to do that. And if you've ever done any work with Nginx configs, right, you can tell it's tuned for performance and not for any kind of security or restrictions, and you're very limited as to the logic that you can do within Nginx as well. So yeah, I think you very nicely pointed that out for our audience, that you need some real security technologies if you want to use it for access restrictions.
In many cases, yeah. But actually, Nginx and Apache reverse proxy, they're quite good. They have some issues, some small things, but in my case, they can protect.
Yeah,
especially in if you configure it correctly, you can do it in a good way. But such things like HA proxy or varnish or some other things, it's really hard to configure them correctly to restrict access to somewhere or something like that.
Nice.
And also, for me personally, it was interesting to see how different vendors, how they understand some kind of RFCs, how do they choose which approach to use and how to parse requests, because RFC is not so clear as usual, and it was interesting, to see how different people implement one thing but differently.
Awesome. That's actually really cool to hear about as well. And of course, I imagine at some point they'll be able to actually check out your slides, et cetera, for Zero Nights once they go live from the conference. But with that, are you ready for Application Security Weekly's 5 questions?
Yes.
Good. I was hoping you were going to say yes. So what were the specs like on your first computer?
Oh, yeah. Actually, it was 20 years ago, almost exactly 20 years ago. And my first computer was Pentium, the first Pentium, 200 megahertz and with 32 megabytes of RAM. And that's all what I remember.
Wow. Well, still, it's pretty good. So then I got to ask, though, so for 20 years ago, actually, that was pretty good indeed. It's about pretty similar to what I had. But what programming language did you learn first?
It was Perl.
Oh, really? Wow. Gosh, how many Perl developers these days? That's pretty awesome. And then, of course, got to ask, Vim or Emacs?
Vim, but I don't care much, but okay, it will be Vim.
Gotcha. So then if you're writing code and you're especially writing it in Vim with Perl, we got to ask you, spaces or tabs?
Oh, yeah. At first, it was tabs. But, with a lot of pain, Python forced me to use spaces.
Gotcha.
So now it's spaces.
Same. It's spaces, basically 4 spaces as a tab is the way I always do it. Lastly, though, what sort of advice would you have for newcomers in the industry?
I think the most important thing is that you need to understand how technologies works, how some kind of software works, and you need to understand why certain vulnerabilities or attacks exist at all. To know reasons why vulnerability exists. And if you usually it takes much time, to understand everything, but eventually you will be able to see some kind of patterns, how things works and how why vulnerabilities exist, and you will be able to find such vulnerabilities easier. And yeah, something like that.
Gotcha. Well, with that, to check out the work that Aleksei is doing and all the good folks at Acunetix have put together, go to acunetix.com/securityweekly. Aleksei, thank you very much for joining us on Application Security Weekly. With that, we are going to take a short break and then come back for the news.